Okay, let's get started here. Thank you all for joining us this morning in this panel. Thanks to the Navy League for hosting. Congratulations to the team at the Navy League and the Center for Maritime Strategy. Spectacular conference the last 3 days, and we're excited to be here with you. Thanks to the panelists for joining us today. And I've been looking forward to this discussion for quite a long time, and I hope it doesn't disappoint. So, my name is Michael Roberts. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for Maritime Strategy here at the Navy League, as well as a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute, and a former senior executive at Crowley Maritime. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment. I should give you a heads up front that we have some changes in the lineup. Last minute, Parker Harrison, who was scheduled to be speaking on behalf of the carrier side, advised last evening that she had to cancel her plans because of a family health emergency. And then a second change just this morning, Augie Tellez, who was speaking on behalf of labor, had a home emergency that has kept him away. We're fortunate to have Sara Fuentes join to share her thoughts on the labor issues, and she's been at the forefront of working on those issues. So thank you, Sara, very much for joining us this morning. I'll try and cover on the carrier side of things, having a bit of a background with Crowley Maritime. So let me offer just some initial thoughts as background for this panel. This is about commercial maritime issues. International markets for shipping and shipbuilding are wide open. They are textbook examples of free trade, call it fundamentalism. Shipping and capital in this industry flows to the companies that have the lowest cost, lowest tax and regulatory burdens, the highest amounts of government support. And shipping and shipbuilding companies based in the United States and most other advanced economies have comparatively high cost, tax and regulatory burdens and receive very limited government support. As a result, American commercial shipping and shipbuilding companies would not exist today were it not for laws that support a handful of U.S. flagged ships in international trade and reserve the substantial domestic markets to American ships. For 75 years, for the most part, the relatively small size of the American maritime industry has been mostly a theoretical concern from a national military and economic security perspective. That all changed with China for reasons that this audience well understands. And as this most consequential geopolitical competition since at least the Cold War continues to evolve, one in which military and commercial maritime capabilities are crucial, we find ourselves with a clearly undersized American commercial maritime industrial base, or network, as Hondo referred to it yesterday. Our surge sea lift fleet averages 45 years old and is backed by a sustainment fleet of just 85 active U.S. flagged commercial ships sailing internationally, which is less than half the number realistically needed in a Western Pacific confrontation. Perhaps greater concern is China's growing dominance over key links in the global maritime supply chain. 100 ports in 63 countries around the world, 50% of commercial shipbuilding construction order book, 80% in the news recently, 80% of ship-to-shore crane production is based in China, and so on. Capabilities that China could use for surveillance, for sabotage, and for active measures that could cripple the American economy. In contrast, our commercial shipbuilding and mariner industrial bases reflect the economic and competitive realities that I just mentioned, and today are simply too small to contribute at the scale needed to confront the threat from China. This all means that we have significant gaps in our current ability to deter Chinese aggression. Our economy is vulnerable, and our industrial base or network is just too small, and we have maybe 3 to 5 years to do something about it. The good news is that we're not starting from scratch. We have an aggressive and entrepreneurial American industry that in collaboration with government and our allies can scale up to meet the challenge. And in that regard, let me take just a couple more minutes to share some thoughts from the carrier perspective about what that means. And I think it comes down to 3 points that I think are important to share from the carrier perspective. Awareness is number one, and I'll elaborate. Number 2 and 3 are realism and then a mindset change. In terms of awareness, I'll just begin with a short story. I remember doing a briefing with a senior staffer at the National Security Council early in the Biden administration, going over the sort of the Crowley resume of capabilities and accomplishments over the years, talking about the 40 ships, the 40 tankers that the company owns and operates in domestic trades, a very sophisticated container shipping network and logistics network in the Caribbean and Central American markets where the company competes successfully against the global carriers, Maersk and CMA, CGM, and so on. So the investment that the company made in new ships in the domestic Puerto Rico trade, ships built in the United States that are sort of among the first in the world to be fueled by alternative fuels, liquefied natural gas, and some of the emergency response work from Haiti in 2010 to Hurricane Maria 2014, the Ebola response in West Africa in 2014, and so on. And I finished my brief to this National Security Advisor Council staffer, and he just looked at me and said, he had no idea that companies in this country could do this kind of work. And he said, I'd asked the question of others whether we have that capability, and been told, no, that's all been offshore. And Crowley is not the only company that has these capabilities. There's great examples from other companies, and I didn't want this to be a Crowley commercial here. And I'll mention a couple of examples. Pasha, for example, in the context of the supply chain crunch, in the course of 6 months, chartered 11 ships to go trans-Pacific to take up the slack and bring cargo through to the east to the West Coast. They scaled that up and scaled it back down in a matter of 6 months. Entrepreneurial, finding needs and opportunities and responding to those opportunities, and there are many others in the industry. So, these are companies that compete in tough commercial markets on a day-in, day-out basis. They have to innovate. They have to cut costs to get customers' business and still make a profit. And they have a lot to offer our government, including the ability to solve many of the key security problems that we now face. When we talk about the emergency response work that these companies do, we are in a sort of an emergency response framework now with China. It's a whole different scale than if we're talking about a hurricane, but we are in a position, we are capable of scaling up to meet that challenge. So just awareness about the capabilities of this industry, and Ben's going to have talk a little bit about that from the shipbuilding side also. I think it's just extremely important. And one final point on that, and these are complete organizations. We think about the maritime industry as ships and mariners. That's the core of the issue. But these are systems and networks that run, and relationships that run across the ecosystem, from customers to suppliers to ports and around the world. And that the value of all of that entire system is what needs to be kept in mind when we talk about the ability of this industry to help respond to the security challenges we face today. The second point I would make from a carrier perspective is the mindset shift. This industry, somebody mentioned earlier today how we've gone through 2 generations of, in this case, Coast Guard policy and with a certain mindset in mind. In the case of the commercial maritime industry, for generations, We have been effectively in a defensive crouch. We're grateful for anything we can get in the American maritime side of things, with a few exceptions from time to time. We are now needed, our country needs us to do a lot more. And we need to think, we need to understand what that is. We need to think of what we can do as an industry to respond to that need and respond. As an example, in the case of the microchip industry, that industry is down to something like 11% U.S. manufacturing of microchips. And Congress decided that that's not enough, that the vulnerability we have with microchip production in China and Taiwan, vulnerable, and South Korea, puts our economy at risk. And so invested many billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, to reshore some of that manufacturing, to bring our microchip manufacturing capability up to something like 20, 25%, whatever the market share is. The statutes today, the maritime statute says that American ships and shipping companies, U.S.-built ships, should carry a significant share of our import-export trade. We're at 1% now. That's not a significant share. We need to have a stake in this and to have credibility at the table in international maritime supply chains and provide sea lift and other security benefits for the country. We need to be at something a lot more than 1%. And whether that's 3% or 5% or 10 or 20%, that's the mindset we need to have as we think forward. And then the third point, I think, from a carrier perspective is just realism. There's not a magic wand. We have an inherent cost disadvantage, an inherent disadvantage in terms of government programs that have been in place for a long time. A study released in 2020 by CSIS estimated that the Chinese government has invested $115 billion over a 10-year period in its commercial maritime capabilities. And we're not close to that. Trust me on that. And so we have to understand that it's going to take investment. It's got to be smart investment. We've got to be good with taxpayer dollars. But it's going to take some government investment in the near and midterm to make that work. Longer term, there may be other options, but there's no magic wand out there. So with that, let me stop. I've talked too long already, and pivot to introduce our first panelist. I'm going to start at the far end with Ben Bordelon. Ben is the president and CEO of Bollinger Shipyards. Bollinger is the largest privately owned shipbuilding company in the United States. Ben is a graduate of Louisiana State University. He joined Bollinger in 2000 after retiring from the San Diego Chargers football team. He was the executive vice president for repair at Bollinger before assuming his current role in 2014. Ben is also the chairman of the Shipbuilders Council of America and a board member of the Offshore Marine Service Association. Welcome, Ben. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Be remiss without saying go Tigers. Our ladies won a national championship Monday. In case you weren't, Sunday, I'm sorry, in case you weren't watching. So that was a little exciting for us. But thanks for having me. I was thinking this was going to be more of a discussion type setting. So I think with that, I'll tell a little bit about Bollinger and who we are and what we do briefly. Because we do both. We do government and we do commercial. And I think it's very relevant in what we're trying to accomplish as a shipbuilding industry. But my grandfather started our business in 1946, and it was a good American story, not college educated, and was a machinist by trade, and bought an old lathe and a drill press at a World War II auction in New Orleans and started our business. And since then, we went through, repair market evolution. We started into new builds, and really our first tranche into the government contracting was in the 80s. when we started building for the Coast Guard. And really, we've been in the government contracting world since then. And I like to always say that we're going to stay in both markets because I go back to my grandfather and that too. He was not an advocate of us doing government work. He said it's going to make you fat and inefficient, and kind of right in some degree. But at the same token, working commercially helps keep your blade sharp, and so we like to do both. But we went out and got in both markets and offered us some diversification. Really during, market times in oil and gas where it went down, and that's some of the issues that we face commercially. It's so cyclical, and not having the consistent workflow is definitely a challenge for us to manage through. And I'll talk some more about this, Mike, in a minute. But since then, we've delivered Coast Guard boats, Navy ships. We're building for National Science Foundation now, tugboats. We built for Crowley. We built offshore supply vessels. We built stuff for SpaceX. We've done a lot of different things. So, as a Bollinger voice right now, I feel like we're a good, microcosm of shipbuilding in the U.S. And you talk about entrepreneurial spirit. That's something that we try to figure out early, what we're going to do and focus on, and we have grown. From my grandfather and a helper to now we're at 3,500 people that are my direct reports. Not direct reports. I don't need that many. We're not that fat. But we have a big vendor base, supply base that we also affect. I do operate vessels too, so we have that expertise on the other side of it. But, when you look at our response and what we're going to do to combat the current situation, and some of y'all heard me possibly speak on a previous panel. The best way for us to invest in shipyards and continue to do that is have some visibility of work, and that goes both commercial and government. There's a lot of one-off commercial vessels that are built. Unfortunately, here in the U.S., you look at some other areas of the world, and you might have a 72-ship backlog of container ships or carriers or different things that there's multiple runs. We have an issue here that you don't have that opportunity often. One example I think that shows good productivity and efficiency. We currently, from the Bollinger Hat side, we're building for the U.S. Coast Guard the fast response cutters. We just cut boat 62, but the efficiencies we've seen and learning curves we've had in that program certainly can be duplicated into other things if you have multiple runs. But you have to have some visibility going forward to really invest in a program, really invest in your shipyard. I tell everybody that works for me, we got to make money. And I'm not saying that to be greedy. It's because shipyards are expensive to operate. And to continue to reinvest in shipyards, in high technology, we have labor issues. That's not a secret. I think if you work in shipbuilding or you work for the Coast Guard, you work for the Navy, you work in this hotel, probably have a labor problem. So we're managing through that. That's not something that's a new issue. I don't ever remember the shipyard where it's easy to get workers. Some years may be better than others, but it's always going to be a challenge. But we need to continue to invest in technology and efficiencies that are driving shipbuilding costs down. There's no question that's obviously the idea. Kind of dumbing down the process, if you want to call it that, of more front-end engineering, spending more time, becoming efficient in the engineering process is obviously going to make way on the production side. But I think our biggest challenge, Mike, is having a maritime strategy would actually be really nice. And I know we've had that over different years, both commercial and government. Commercial seems not as visible to most. Oil and gas, you talked about 2014, at the end of 2014, for those who are in the industry, oil and gas fell off the face of the earth quickly. I'll never forget the day when I saw oil was trading negative. So it got pretty salty pretty quick, and hence all the orders stopped, literally. So commercially, we went from a backlog of supply vessels, tugboats, barges, probably was building ATBs and ships, and then it just pretty much stopped. That's pretty tough as a shipbuilding community. And fortunately for us, we pivoted to more of the government side of our business. We also do repair work as well, but that's the kind of challenges we see, and how do you take that next step forward to compete in the global market? You have to have some visibility and some leadership of where we're trying to get to. You know, you talked about replacing 45-year-old ships. We keep saying that as an industry. We keep hearing that. It'd be nice if we had some real commitment, because frankly, the U.S. industry, if there's a market, we're going to invest heavily in it and probably overdo it. That's kind of what America's known for mostly. But from a shipbuilding side, I could tell you, we have over 120 shipyards spread out across America, from Hawaii to Groton, Connecticut, and obviously down the bayou in Louisiana, ready to invest. We just need the market. One of the things that, Mike, I know you're familiar with, you talked about, different laws. We do have different laws here. We actually have to, in shipyards, keep our people safe, pay them good benefits, don't pollute, all of the things that some other nations are not as focused on. We do have cabotage law here that from the Jones Act side that helps shipbuilding and helps mariners. Very, very fearful if that would ever change, because, in times when I'm not doing government work, I'm doing commercial work, and I'm keeping my workforce somewhat balanced by having a mix of different projects going on at the same time. So, if you fully focused on one market, that's great when it's good, but it's terrible when it's not. So it's nice to have some diversity in what you do and the capabilities you have. But, there seems to be always constant attacks on the Jones Act, Mike, as you know. It's one thing that we're big supporters of, because without it, I can't imagine having, we talk about China, you'd end up with Chinese vessels being built, Navy boats, and I can't see that. I need to stop calling them Navy boats, Navy ships. Sorry about that in the room, but I think the biggest message I'd like to leave, and I know we're going to have questions, is we're ready to respond. The shipbuilding markets, community's ready to respond. We can always ramp up. Again, we just have to see the work that's coming, so we can effectively front-end invest not only in infrastructure but in our workforce, because the easiest recruiting tool for me as a shipbuilder is visibility of work. If I can go recruit a person and say, we have 15 years of work, it's a definitely investment for them. They're willing to move. But if I'm playing this up and down, work 50 hours a week for 18 months and then I lay you off, and that's not a career. So having visibility to see it in front is definitely where we need to get to. But we're ready to respond and just need to work.
Great. Really, really well done. I'm going to shift now to the labor side of things. Sada Fuentes is a veteran of the Navy League and is now with the Transportation Institute. She's a rising star in the industry, great energy and great knowledge, and has been helping to lead an effort by the National Defense Transportation, or related to the National Defense Transportation Association, around mariner development, workforce development. And Sada, you want to talk a little bit about that, or whatever's on your mind?
Sure. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to the Navy League for putting on such a great event, and thank you for Mike for making this topic so relevant. I know you, the Hudson Institute, and the Center for Maritime Strategy are doing a lot of work on this topic, and so we're excited to see where that goes. For the audience, I am very sorry, and I apologize to you that I am not Augie Tellez. For those of you that have met him, he's very passionate and very knowledgeable. So I'll do my best to provide that labor perspective. Something that makes the maritime industry a bit unique is that labor and carriers are always on the same page. Just last Thursday, we had our big congressional sail-in, and every team had a representative from industry and a representative from labor. So that's something that makes this community very special, I think, is that we all want the same things. We recognize what the threat is, and we recognize what we need to do to get there, and so we are often able to speak with one voice. Just as Mike said, it is a very unfair market. You know, it's really a race to the bottom against some floating sweatshops. The Chinese Communist Party is able to think in decades, in centuries, when they do their strategic planning. When they think about maritime, they're able to do a lot of long-term planning that, you know, due to the nature of America, we just can't, right? We're stuck in these kind of shorter cycles and aren't able to think long-term. So like Mr. Borlaug said, we really need a long-term national maritime strategy so we can think in decades as well and plan for that, because that is what our competition is doing. And what you see the Chinese Communist Party doing is very similar to a kind of just a typical corporate bully, right? They are flooding the market, they're lowering prices, they're trying to drive all of us out of business. They want to dominate shipping. Everything from mariners to the fishing industry to shipbuilding. They have read their Mahan and they know exactly what they want to do, and they are right. You know, this whole theme is a maritime century. America is a maritime nation, and so it is really critical that we step up our game as well in order to better compete, because it is critical, and we want to make sure that we do have that assured access to sea lift, to shipbuilding, to mariners, to containers that we need for our economy to thrive, for us to be economically independent, and for our national security to be strong. So some things that I think, you know, to get back to the topic of changing commercial maritime policy to better compete, the really big one is that national maritime strategy, to be thinking about maritime holistically. The Coast Guard, the Department of Transportation, the Department of the Navy, NOAA, everyone should be talking to each other to develop a holistic strategy where we can attack this problem all together. Another big piece of it is making sure that the work is there. The panel before this was on workforce development, and everyone has these challenges of trying to find the right people. And something that helps individuals, especially young people, make a career choice is to know that there's going to be a future there, right? Like, you don't want to devote all this time to training and education and learning for an industry that's going to disappear. Nobody wants that. So what we really need to make sure that we do is have that stability and have that guarantee to our young mariners, to our young shipyard workers. Yes, we are making a commitment. This country is making a commitment to American maritime, to this industry, and there is a future for you there. So how can we do that? There's a number of different ways. There's a couple of different policies that Mike mentioned. The Jones Act, making sure that remains strong and that it has full support. It is critical. As Ben mentioned, you do not want Chinese shipyards building Navy vessels. You also don't want Chinese mariners sailing up and down the Mississippi in our inland waterways. That is a huge vulnerability that we need to protect. Our non-contiguous states like Alaska, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii need that dependable service. We do not want them dependent on the whims of the market. They were really well protected during the COVID pandemic, thanks to the Jones Act, thanks to that regular, reliable service. We should also continue to fund the Maritime Security Program. Look at that policy, make sure it's authorized in 10-year chunks, with the amount going up every year, but it's hard to predict what inflation is going to do over 10 years. And so we should constantly be reassessing that and making sure that that funding level is appropriate to incentivize the carriers to continue to fly U.S. flag, to continue to employ American mariners, and to continue to do the recapitalization that they do at no cost to taxpayer dollars that we need to make sure that we have the sea lift capacity that we need. And we also need to enforce cargo preference laws. And even expand them, right? We have 100% of DoD compliance with cargo preference, must ship U.S. flag. Civilian cargo preference is only 50%. I would love to see that go to 100%. I would like for there to be incentives for big box carriers to continue to also ship U.S. flag. We need to have all types of policies like that so we can make sure that there is that steady work for mariners considering entering the workforce. In the industry, we also talk a lot about how cargo is king. So if we want the workforce there in war, we need to make sure that they're able to work during peace. So cargo preference, that commercial work is a huge part of that. I was fortunate last week to go visit the American Merchant Marine veterans at their annual convention, and they have veterans from World War II to Iraqi freedom. And these guys are passionate. They are very, very proud of what they've done. You know, they have answered the call from the Revolutionary War to today. They have been there when we need them, but we've got to make sure that we are providing them opportunities well into the future. So that way they feel that sense of security and that sense of mission. You know, they are devoted to this country. They love doing that work. They are very, very proud of it, and they want to be there. But everyone's got to eat. They want to know that there's going to be a job for them when they graduate. If they're telling their children to go into this industry, they want to know that there's a future. So there's some exciting new opportunities coming online. The Tanker Security Program, offshore wind are a couple of new opportunities for growth where we expect to see a lot of new maritime jobs. We just need our government to kind of create that kind of whole maritime strategy that can guarantee, yes, we are committed to this industry, we are a maritime nation, and we are going to guarantee work for our mariners, for our maritime community, for our shipyards well into the future, because this is who we are and this is what we should be doing.
Well done. Well done. Thank you. The final panelist, Kevin Tokarski. Kevin is the Associate Administrator for Sealift at the Maritime Administration, graduated from SUNY Maritime College, and holds master's degrees from the University of Maryland and the Naval War College. Kevin was selected for the Senior Executive Service in 2008. Associate Administrator, his responsibilities for strategic sealift programs, including the Ready Reserve Force, maritime security and cargo preference programs, and many other key programs. He is also the chairman of the Transport Group for Ocean Shipping for the NATO Enablement and Resilience section. Kevin served as the lead for the Biden-Harris transition team and executive director of MARAD in 2020 and 21. Kevin is an active member of the National Defense Transportation Association and a life member of the Navy League of the United States. And Kevin, great to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Mike, thanks, and thanks to the panelists for coming together here, and also especially from the Maritime Administration, thanks to the Navy League. The Navy League has been an outstanding supporter for our maritime industry and our policies and programs. We have a great linkage with that. So from Luke, Julia, Kevin, Tish, the whole, Mike's as well, all the way down, great relationship. And thanks for putting on this annual forum, and that where we can talk all things maritime. I also want to thank the international partners that are here. As Mike mentioned, my NATO work that I do, it's nice that now I don't have to refer to Finland as a +1. And that, so that actually now being part of, yeah, thanks, yeah, being part of it. And I welcome, and I'm waiting for the other +1, Sweden, to join as well. But they are our part of how we change our maritime policies globally, because we're all in this together. And it's not, so this is not just strictly a U.S. concern. We really need to be thinking about that, about how we can leverage what we're doing and making sure we're picking the right allies and partners to help us along as we strive here. So this theme here of a maritime century got me thinking about what's the next maritime century going to look like. I don't think anybody can really kind of predict that. I know the oceans will still be there, right? They might be a little closer, higher up. To my property, I know that will happen. But Sarah mentioned something about when I used to start these briefings and that I talked about, who still reads Mahan Sea Power. I know China did. China does. Sometimes I kind of think maybe we forgot about that a little bit. But I think there has been an awakening, certainly in the last couple of years, because we finally realized that, this is important. We need this. And people waking up to, having discussions at their dining room tables about supply chain and logistics. Go figure, right? So I think that how we think about our priorities and awareness and reflect on how the current world has turned out over the last 3 years, do you feel better about it, or do you feel worse about it? I'm not in the comfort zone about where the globe is today and how we're operating in our supply chain. The workforce has changed. Sarah mentioned this. Supply chains have changed. The dependency on outsourcing has started some shifts in thinking about that, the vulnerabilities associated with that. And then here we sit and we watch an awe of a major conventional war that's taking place, highlighting supply chain, defense industrial base, partnerships, global economic factors, all associated with that conflict. and the roles of nearly every nation picking sides, whether explicitly or not. COVID caused us to think differently and to ask a lot of questions, and I think that's the good aspect of that global pandemic. It forced us to rethink and reshape our direction. Heck, I even think we were able to finally get NATO to start thinking about China as not just a U.S. concern. And I heard it. I heard it at the DepSecGen level in her office a couple years ago, where actually now SecGen has said what China does matter to the NATO alliance. That was not always the case. I won't belabor the facts about the number of ships that they have, the number of ports they've invested in around the globe, the amount of operating subsidies they provide, or the shipbuilding capacity that they have. You all know that. And as I've said for a long time, their national maritime strategy, I'd love to have a piece of it, or ours. As we think about China, the natural response might be to want to match them. I don't think we can, or that we're not that type of government to do that. We can't muster that type of industrial policy, and it presents a whole host of challenges. So the CHIPS Act aside, we're likely not ready for that kind of sweeping legislation support. But I do think that we can work towards a SHIPS Act. The questions are what matters to our economic and our military security, and figuring out those that matter to the point that we can unify action. Actions by themselves, if necessary, but more than likely with a wide spectrum of partners, including our fourth component, the maritime industry, and our allies, and look at the shared response of protecting our interests. Today, we do have significant challenges with sea lift. From limited industrial capacity for repairs and shipbuilding, challenges with mariners going back to sea and attracting new entrants into the seagoing career. And even if just for the first 10 years of a career, if they went back to sea, that would be great. Operating U.S. flagships in a global marketplace that is anything but even. We are competitive, but it's just not even. Sarah mentioned that. And the constant misinformation and challenges about our own coastwise shipping laws and what that means in our domestic shipping arena. We do need realistic goals that can be achieved over time. And while it is unacceptable in many views, carrying only 1 to 1.5% of our domestic and international cargo on U.S. flag ships, how about we settle on 5%? If you walk out the door and you talk to a common person on the street and ask them a question, how much should we carry? They might say, we should carry half of it. It's not realistic. But if we just did 5%, and that's not a big goal, I'll get you acknowledge that. We'll wear T-shirts saying, hey, I want to be 5% of our national trade. But 5% would take us back to a 1970 level of what we'd shipped. And it would be a significantly different world in terms of our sea lift capabilities in supporting economic and national, and particularly the national security side of that. That would get us to around that 250 ship, concept and idea. And Mike, I agree with you. It's reasonable. We can get there. It's how we coordinate to be able to do that and sync that. As I mentioned, shipbuilding and repair, labor, port infrastructure efficiencies also have to be ingrained into this national strategy. We have to look at the whole supply chain and how freight moves, who moves it, and who makes the decisions about the movement of freight. So often we focus on owners and operators of ships, and yet it's the cargo shippers that make the decisions on where and how cargo is moved. So as Sarah mentioned, cargo is king. So those that control the cargo, they control the king's treasures. We need to include them in the equations of anything that we develop going forward, to include the elusive idea of having some type of shipper credit. And to be clear, nothing is going to happen unless we have a concerted effort at investment. And I don't think that will happen until we change the framework to have a linked national maritime strategy that bridges all sectors of the sphere, protecting the supply chains to meet economic and national security needs, shippers and ship owners, finance, repairs and rebuilding of ships, ports and labor. And this is the hardest part because everybody has their piece and they want to protect their piece. But we've got to break down those barriers and integrate it together. I remember one of my senior leaders, my senior mentor, Maritime Administrator Admiral Al Herberger, who was also the first Deputy Commander of U.S. Transportation Command. I remember him telling me the story of the first staff meeting at the newly established U.S. Transportation Command, now 30 years in the making. When General Dwayne Cassidy asked him, he said, hey, Al, you're the sea lift guy. What do we need to do? So he told the commander that we need a national strategy. And that push, that statement, led to the development of National Security Directive number 28. Our sealift policy, driven by U.S. Transcom and the Joint Staff, not by DOT or MARAD, and getting President Bush to sign it in 1989. We lived by that policy for nearly now 35 years. It serves well and strong to support the U.S. flag fleet, becoming one of the foundational aspects of justifying Al Herberger's reshaping of MARAD from a subsidy organization to one that became a national security and strategic sealift focus as the core mission essential tasks in supporting DoD. The VISA and MSP programs followed those steps, as did the National Shipbuilding Initiative and reinvigorating the financial side of shipbuilding support. But things have changed. Admiral Herberger was laid to rest this past Valentine's Day at Arlington National Cemetery. And I think we owe it to his legacy of visionary change to build a new national framework of a broad, linked national maritime strategy, with at the core a new national security directive. I've been discussing that with the past and the current administrations. I even put it on the table with the current Transcom commander. It's something that we need to do. A new national security directive that will set the table for why we need to change and address these sealift challenges to meet the global challenges. Recall in 1989, the current policy, we weren't thinking of China as we do today. The Iron Curtain hadn't fallen yet. And our global perspective has changed dramatically and added new allies and partners. It's time to rethink what we need in maritime strength, where it needs to be operating and how it should be supporting economic supply chain resilience and independence, as well as to meet the needs of DoD in a vastly different context. Our commercial and government maritime and sealift perspectives need to be incorporated into maritime strategies that address Navy, Coast Guard, and Marine Corps views. Maritime strategy is just not theirs. It needs to be ours as well. So why aren't we thinking that having a U.S. flag commercial ship sailing through the South China Sea on a daily basis wouldn't be good for freedom of navigation and global presence? The workplace has changed, supply chains have changed, the dependency on outsourcing has started, some shifts in thinking, and as we watch in awe as the major, I said that already, excuse me. We have to look at the whole of the supply chain, and I did that one too. Excuse me.
I hate when that happens.
Dude.
Don't worry about it.
That's all right.
Why don't we go ahead?
Okay. And so at the end of this, I think the idea and the notion that we have a broad-based linked strategy that it touches on the importance of all these aspects needs to be bridged and to be brought forward. But I do think it's going to the change to help to push this is a new national security directive and a refocusing of our resources and restatement of our need for this industry collectively in supporting economic and national security needs. Thank you, Mike.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one complex and full question here, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience, and I make sure that I touch on a few things here. But you mentioned the 250 ship idea, the idea that we would go today from 85 ships, U.S. flag commercial ships active in trade internationally, to 250, roughly tripling the size of the U.S. flag fleet as a goal, as part of the strategy that we all acknowledge we need. A strategy, and obviously that number needs to be validated through appropriate studies, but that's a pretty good number when you consider that Admiral Busby, who knows as much about sealift as anybody, put it out there. I think that when you think about saying 10 years from now we're going to have a fleet of 250 ships, they're going to be U.S. built, they're going to be U.S. flagged, and so on. 250 ships, let me start with you, Ben. If you had 250 ships with 2 or 3 different ship types, could you get the kind of multiple runs and series production that you need to start driving efficiencies into the process?
Yeah, I would hope by ship 100 we're doing better. Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, having that kind of clarity going forward would be fantastic. And I think you would see some pretty heavy investment in multiple shipyards to respond. Depending on the size ship, obviously that limits somewhat the players out there. But if you had a strategy that was talking about building 250 ships, and let me magnify, clarify, and it's real, that it's really going to happen. I think you'd see some really major investment. You'd see some, collaborations. I think that would happen to respond. This is one thing I've always talked about. The fear is right now, even with the current Navy build, which is on the government side, more, in the event we had, a conflict or something, how would we respond? The answer is we're going to respond because there would be an immediacy and a real program out there. So I think, Mike, it's an easy answer. Yes, 250 would be fantastic. As a shipbuilder, we'd want to see some realness of that plan and real commitment.
Yeah. And from a mariner perspective, I presume similar answer. You have the certainty that you can offer when you're recruiting and training and then retaining.
Right, exactly. Like you want to be a part of an industry that's growing, that's thriving. So if you have that kind of commitment and that kind of excitement and kind of national agreement that this is what we're going to do, labor would absolutely rise to the challenge. Right now the challenges that the workforce is facing are similar to those that are faced across the services, across retail, across the food service industry. I mean, everyone has these same challenges. So what's facing maritime is not unique. But I think if you had that commitment and that certainty, maritime would rise to meet that occasion, just as they have in the past every other time. Like at that Veterans Conference, there were folks who are ready to sail again. They love it. And so I think once you have that opportunity, the people will be there.
Right. And then Kevin, from a cost perspective, these are ships that are sailing, presumably sailing day in and day out in commercial markets, earning revenue in straightforward commercial transactions for the most part. And so the cost aspect of this, any thoughts on what it costs, relatively speaking, to help solve our shipbuilding industrial-based problem and our mariner industrial-based problem and contribute to our economic security through a program like this?
And I think I go back to the word investment, because I think that if we have the fortitude to make an investment early on for a shipbuilding initiative, where we recognize that at the end of that life cycle of those ships, they come into our reserve fleet. I would rather have the approach that I start at day one with a U.S. flag operator who's operating a ship that has good military utility. It's not a strictly military vessel, but it has good military and economic utility. We make that investment, and then it goes and it sails for 10, 15, maybe 20, as long as 20 years. And at the end of that, we recycle it back into our reserve fleet. I've got known capabilities. And so my suggestion is that we make that investment today. I buy partial ownership today. It's not that far different than what we used to do in our Title 11 programs and in construction differential subsidy programs, where we made an investment, and then the ships at the end of 25 years, they came into our fleet site. My concern to how we do in sea lift recapitalization today is all I get is what's available to us to buy. So we poke our head up on the surface, we do a 360, and what's out there is the only thing that's out there. We're not able to build what we need. This idea about us being able to build, and this is part of when I use that word linked, that we're linking a national strategy, making the investment up front. And at the back end of it, I know I've got reserve sea lift capacity, and I know what it is and what it's going to look like.
Great. I don't see big long lines at the questions at the microphone, but why don't we go ahead and begin, sir? Please say your name and.
Good morning, Lieutenant Colonel Chris Georgi. I'm a China Foreign Area Officer in the Marine Corps. I first became aware of the Jones Act a little over a decade ago when I was moving from Taiwan to Hawaii, and I was told my household goods and car were going to take an extra month to get there because they had to go through Seattle. And most of what you read about the Jones Act tends to be pretty negative about it, talking about antiquated, but you've obviously a couple of you have both addressed the value of the Jones Act. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why it's important, why we need to preserve it, or if there are maybe modifications that could make it more user-friendly, because it seems like the general impression I get when I read about it is it's driving up costs for manufacturers and consumers and things of that nature.
I would completely disagree. I think the Jones Act is one of my favorite subjects. We talk about these three benefits that the Jones Act brings: economic security, homeland security, and national security. So economic security has created 650,000 jobs across the country. And also, if you're doing any shipping, you do want that money to go back to American workers, to American companies, and to American taxpayers so they can spend that money back in America. We do not want that money of shipping American goods or American transport worker stuff to go into the pocket of our competitors, of people that are trying to drive us out of business. We want those jobs, we want that industrial base, we want that knowledge. That's what we've been talking about, is making sure you have that job stability. And the Jones Act provides that. Like you see requests for waivers after natural disasters, and that drives me insane because those workers are the people whose homes were destroyed, and now they need that money, they need that work, from that disaster. They need that opportunity. The homeland security piece is about again, those inland waterways and their maritime borders, that maritime border security. We all know the Coast Guard is woefully underfunded, and giving them even more to check and more stuff to worry about when you're letting the lowest bidder come into your inland waterways is just asking for trouble. And then the national security piece of it is that you are able to create a shipyard industrial base without spending any government money, right? Like you have these shipyard workers that are trained and that are always working, that are not dependent on the kind of feast or famine shipbuilding cycles that you see from government. And also you have a crew of mariners that are available and working. The Jones Act fleet provides a large crew of workers that do have that international license, that are ready to crew cabin ships. So it is really critical. And when you talk about increasing the cost, if you go with a foreign flag competitor, do you really think those savings are going to be passed along to the consumer? Like, there's no way. That is not going to make a difference. So you would be selling our economic security, our homeland security, and our national security to the lowest bidder for no benefit to the consumer at the end of the day. And if you think about the scale of what these ships are moving, it is like, I think one of our studies showed us like 3 cents for a can of soup that it adds. Like, that is not going to make a difference to you at the end of the day. But not having a merchant marine or not having a shipyard industrial base, that is going to affect you. That's going to affect all of us.
We could talk all day about the Jones Act. But thank you for your question. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no, I love it.
Oh, we do. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yep.
Yes, Rick Easton, retired surface warfare officer. So the National Security Directive that you mentioned, obviously sea change from where we were 35 years ago, makes sense. Who's got to lead that effort? And does that include, in your judgment, allies and partners? And if so, how do you see that being folded in? And then underpinning it, assuming that we did have a 250 ship objective to build that comes out of that new national security objective, I heard the administrator and almost everybody talk about the workplace shortage. We're trying to build more Navy ships. We're trying to eventually get to 355 ship Navy. How do we add 250 more commercial ships, which granted may be simpler to build, into that mix without perhaps leveraging a much larger industrial base somehow?
All right. I'd be happy to start. I think it's a glide path to be able to get to there. But I got to know, we need to have a target on the wall, frankly. You need to start with a number of where we're trying to work towards, and to be able to communicate that to industry. Mr. Borland talked about that level of commitment and understanding that, so that industry can make that investment to be able to develop that industrial repair, to be able to build that, or the capacity to have that. Allies and partners are going to be a part of, and have remained, they are in the current National Security Directive, and it says we're going to rely on them, but it also says, but we need to be able to go and defend our interests unilaterally, independently of that. But I think allies and partners do and will play a role, particularly in the global reaches of the Indo-PACOM. And then the first question about
who's got
the lead? So I've asked U.S. Transportation Command's help on this, and General Van Ovost has committed her support along with the J5 Admiral Sobek to look at moving this along. And trying to get the wheels behind this. Because it is a national security directive, Kevin's view is it does need to emanate from the DoD side. for that. Having a combatant commander behind this and the importance of it is I think, very significant than asking the service to be able to push this forward.
Great question.
sir.
Great question, great answer. I had lots of thoughts about it, but they've all flown out of my head. So go ahead, ask your question.
Scott Sunt, Navy League. The question you talked about 100 years from now, so 100 years of maritime superiority. We see the Coast Guard has got the new icebreaker getting ready to be built and coming out. What I'm asking from all three of you is, how do you see that affecting commercial shipping? Are we going to use the Northwest Passage, or are we going to use those passages, or are we going to cede that to somebody else? And also within the infrastructure, are we ready to build ice-hardened ships that will actually be able to operate freely and safely in those areas for the next 100 years? Or are we just going to give it to the South Koreans, or are we going to give it to some other persons? We now have Finland and Sweden. They're up there, and they're going to be operating. They're going to build their ships the right way. Are we going to do the same thing? It is a national security issue because it changes the time-distance issue of getting over into areas of potential conflict. Thank you.
Really good question. Thank you for that. Obviously, the Arctic is the next frontier in terms of maritime activity. The United States has to be there. We have to be there both from a military perspective and a commercial perspective, in my view. Where we spend our funds, we're going to have. We always have limited funds and scarce resources. We'll have to prioritize. We have to figure out what the best way to use those resources is, and sort of figure all of that out. But Arctic is extremely important, and we need to be there, both militarily and. Good question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would applaud the Coast Guard for taking the steps in that and making sure that they are doing the right investment and asking the support from the Congress for the ice-breaking support for that. Commerce will dictate where commerce trades from that perspective. But I think clearly, and you hit on it right, with our northern allies in Norway, Finland, and Sweden, that is opening up and sharing our responsibilities in the Arctic region, and we need to be a player there. And that's, and also to touch on the fisheries resources aspects for that as well.
Good. Admiral Watson.
Scott.
Hey, good morning. Jim Watson with retired Coast Guard and also retired ABS. My question has to do with the policy of effective U.S. control of shipping. And I guess, first of all, let me say I am 100% behind building a 250-ship U.S. flag fleet. But that's still only about 0.5% of the world's international fleet that serves the global economy. And, when you think back in history, after World War II, the United States, distributed what became that fleet of now 44,000 or 50,000 ships. But I think there was a strategy at that time to create this global economy because we didn't like what happened with nationalism, right, in World War II and World War I. But it's now sort of run its course. And we have seen maybe a global competitor grab that concept of effective control of that global fleet, at least a significant portion of it. So in addition to this building project and creating the ships we need for national defense, I think we need to pivot and find a new way to encourage some sort of American control over the broader international globalization fleet. I don't know what that is, but I just wanted to ask about that.
No, I really appreciate that question. I think it's an important point. When you think about economic security around shipping, control over ships is the crew, the captain of the crew on the ship, and it's the management of the ship. And so if we thought that we would solve our economic security problems by having China, COSCO, reflag some of their ships to the United States, I don't think that does a lot to help our security problem. And vice versa, if there were American-owned companies that were crewing their ships or registering their ships in China, you need both. You need American-owned and controlled companies, and you need American-flagged ships to sort of establish that control. Now, it doesn't have to be, the American company doesn't have to have 100% U.S. flag ships to have a seat at that table. Because that's what we're really talking about when you talk about economic security. You know, at 1%, we don't have a seat at the table. We are totally dependent on others to take care of our maritime logistics supply chain in peacetime. And increasingly, that's China. So we need to get a seat at the table. As, you know, a lot of that has to be U.S. flagships, but not all of it. I mean, we still have a benefit if it's a U.S.-controlled company that operates foreign ships. At least that's my view of it, but others may have other thoughts on it.
I'd just add that our NATO allies, we're not the only ones who've lost their flag fleet. Aside from Greece and Norway, they have similar shared concerns about their ability to gain access to the sea for economic as well as their security interests. And so I think, Jim, the idea about shifting from and EUSC, the effective U.S. control fleet, we don't even talk about that anymore. That's an old concept. There's nothing there anymore. But it was an administration issue and promotion to be able to do that for positive reasons. But the control part of that, as Mike alludes to, that's just disappeared. And so there is no control element that we could actually believe with any assurance that we'd be able to gain access to.
From a sea lift perspective, I think that's right. But in terms of economic engagement, you know, the broader scope of a U.S. company's capabilities in that maritime space, I think, would be quite important, and not just U.S. flag. U.S. flag is critical, but also other flags. And final point on that is, if you look at the data, it's interesting to me that you look at the world fleets, and the fleet that has the most national flag vessels is China's by far. They have some foreign flag or open registry vessels, but by far most of the Chinese-owned fleet is Chinese flagged. So they've seen it. They've sort of made that calculation and gone forward. So we are out of time, but we've got two more in line here. So if we can quickly go to those questions, we can.
I can be brief. James Spear, I'm a U.S. seafarer, having sailed U.S. flag, Jones Act, and international flag. And I appreciate the panel today. Ben, Sada, and Kevin, all the comments you made, especially Sada. I think a lot of the data on the value proposition of the Jones Act doesn't always filter through in these kind of conversations, so I really appreciate you sharing that. My question is, if we look at towards a new national security directive or a national maritime strategy or plan, with the goal of, let's say, 250 ships, are there, allies and partners has been mentioned a lot throughout the course of the past couple of days. Is there, in whole or in part, a policy or set of policies amongst our allies and partners that could be considered for a new national security directive or a national maritime plan? Are there allies or partners who you're aware of who would be,
I would tell you just from my workings within NATO. Years ago, there used to be a commitment, and NATO pledged ships by their NATO flags to a common pool of ships. That no longer exists. Now, transportation is a national responsibility, so each nation is on its own. And the concern that we've been raising in the NATO front is that when we have a major crisis going on, we're all going to be competing for the same ships and trying to charter the same market. So we need to strengthen our capabilities collectively and individually so that we can amass strength that way.
I would also like to see our allies ask us for more. There's that 2% defense commitment. Yeah. If we could say, okay, if instead of spending 2% on your defense, you commit to doing 2% U.S. flag shipping to help us invest in that pool, I think that's something that would benefit everyone. So I would ask our allies to do a little bit more U.S. flag shipping because they know historically that we're the ones who deliver. They're counting on our sea lift, and so they could pay us back that way as a way to try and build up our fleet.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Last question.
Good morning and thank you. I'm Doris McBride with the U.S. Coast Guard. I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Mr. Watkins said, and my question is simply that given the investment that the U.S. has in the maritime industry and the fact that we've had the Jones Act for quite some time, what else can be done to incentivize U.S. owners to flag U.S.? Because we do have the bottoms, it's just that they're not being flagged in this country. Thank you.
I think you have to ask, Amazon and Walmart and those folks for that. I don't know if the answer is a tax credit or a requirement. Congressman Garamendi has introduced a couple of legislations that require, if we're exporting energy products, to have 2% of that go on U.S. flag, and kind of increasing cargo preference and figuring out a way to increase that to the commercial sector. So that is something that I think we need to think about, whether it's incentives or tax credits, or if you make it mandatory. And honestly, you probably need a little bit of both carrot and stick to try and get that happening. You know, after the pandemic, we really thought that those types of shippers would see resiliency and American dependency as a strength, but people went right back to how they were before, looking for the cheapest option. So we've got to figure out ways to do that. Because you're totally right, we need more participation from American companies in the U.S. flag maritime industry.
And I would just say that finding the best way to do it, the optimal way to do it, is really, really important, whether it's shipper tax credits or straight up subsidies or commercial cargo preference of some kind, is very, very important. Ultimately, it's a form of industrial policy that the Wall Street Journal editorial page will hate, but it may be sort of inefficient at the macroeconomic level, but it's also very effective in terms of deciding who wins and who loses in this battle of the commercial maritime industry. As long as we have the kind of system that we have in international trade, which is so wide open, as we started out in the discussion today. So thank you for that question. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, panelists. I think we did pretty well for kind of.
Let's give Sarah a hand here for jumping in here.
Thank you, Sarah.